everyone. Welcome to Lab 8. Lab 8, we're going to be focusing on the respiratory system. So, again, this is mostly anatomy. There will be a little bit of physiology, just very briefly discussed, but really not a lot. We will be focusing mostly, of course, on structures. And on this video, now that COVID restrictions have been released, I've been going in, grabbing models, and bringing them home to do my online classes with. So we're going to actually get to look at the models there as well, which is probably going to make some of these videos a little bit more popular. So I chose quotes to put in the lab as well, and at least some of the ones I've been putting out there. And the one I chose is, when you want to succeed as bad as you want to breathe, then you'll be successful. So I hope you guys really want to succeed. Now, what we're going to see is this system, this will be something we'll be introducing coming up in Unit 3 after next week's exam and lecture, that may only be true for the current semester that I'm recording this, because their lecture exam is the week after after this unit. Now, what we do is we provide areas of gas exchange, okay? Our job is to exchange the oxygen and the carbon dioxide gases and exchange this. We have to exchange it with the air that we breathe in the blood to and from, and go back and forth. Now, also, we use this respiratory system. Parts of it are used to protect surfaces from things like pathogens and dehydration. For example, the nasal cavities humidify and warm the air, mucous membranes and hairs, and respiratory the respiratory associated lymphoid, like the mucosa. We talk about the nasal associated lymphoid tissues, the bronchial associated lymphoid tissues, any of the white blood cells that may be present in the tissues as they went to the peripheral tissues. So we can help fight dehydration and disease. Also, we produce sounds. Now, not all sounds are speech. Speech is kind of meaningful, purposeful, symbolic sounds. Sound is things like groaning and pain, or something like that, versus a speech, which is rhythmically used to produce a variety of different sounds as well that mean something. This is an important part of our communication. This is how I'm communicating with you now. And we oftentimes just kind of think of your larynx as a musical instrument. And this musical instrument works a little bit like many others. Like, you pluck a string, and depending on how tight the string is, that's how fast that string vibrates, and those vibrations come out as sound waves, and the sound waves rhythmically strike the ears. And the characteristics, the intensities, the amplitude, we might say, the pitches, the frequency, all that information gets transferred by the organ of corti in the ear into what we would know as speech, what we would understand anyway. So someone can speak to you in a language you don't understand. They're still doing speech. Speech is this kind of complex phenomenon, and it always fascinates me. The fact that we have the way this all has to work together is pretty fascinating. Now, what I do not have a model that I could bring here. The one that we have is just too big. As I'm teaching online, I record at home, though I am teaching on campus as well. So the days I go in, I grab models, but I can't do all the recording, because at least here I have the noise canceling headphones. I'm down in a room that's a little bit more isolated. So we're going to start off with our nasal cavity. And in the nasal cavity, we're going to have the entrance called the nostrils, or the external nares. And behind the external nares is a space. It's very flexible space where your nostrils go into. The part of the nose where it flares out the side, surrounding the sides of the nostril, are called the vestibule. And the vestibule is this flexible tissue. And inside those areas, we have hairs called vibrissae. Interestingly enough, those are also the names of like the whiskers and things like that on your dog or cat's face is also vibrissae. The vibrissae help remove particles, and what they're basically going to do is they're going to get coated with mucus. You inhale a particle like a pollen particle of dust, a particle of something, and it sticks to the mucus, and then you'll get some clumping and what we refer to commonly as a booger. There is a hard and a soft palate we're going to see. We're going to see the hard and the soft palate. The hard palate is actually going to be composed of the maxillary bone and the palatine bone, where the soft palate's made of soft tissues. But right now, we'll focus on that in the next lab. Right now, I just want to mention that it separates your nasal cavity from the oral cavity. There's kind of an interesting thing is that I can have, like, say, a mouthful of food and still can breathe through my nose because of this organization. Now, between the nasal cavities here, we have two nasal cavities that we typically refer to as left and right has a nasal cavity. Well, there's a reason we have that. It's called the nasal septum. Nasal septum is sometimes it's kind of bent, sometimes it's crooked. Now, normally, it's made out of two things. You have the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, and you have the on the more superior aspect of it, and the bottom inferior aspect of it's made from the vomer, and together this makes a bony nasal septum. Now, sometimes people have deviated septum. This is what that is, where it's bent, and they may have to surgically break it and reassemble it or do things to help breathing through the nose. Now, we are going to see these structures where they are plural. There are multiples of them, the multiple conchae and the meatices. Now, the conchae, a singular concha, is mounds where when air flows over them, it gets a little bit of a swirl to it. And when this swirls over the mounds, because actually one of the names we also call them is turbinates, they'll get turbulence made as it flows around and on top of and between the mounds. The air gets warmed and humidified. And part of the reason why your nose runs on a cold day is you are secreting more liquid into the nasal mucosa, as well as cold air hitting warm nose. It's kind of a little bit like what happens when warm air hits cold glass of drink. And so you get that going on. Now, we'll see three of them. We'll see the superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae, which are on each side. Now, we talk about in A&P1 lab with the bones that the middle nasal conchae is its own bone, technically speaking, by some people's definitions. But we usually treat it as its own bone. Some people might say, oh, it's really just a structure off of this bone. But I think now most people say the middle nasal conchae is its own bone, if that's the case. But that's how we treat it in our lab. The meatices, the superior, middle, and inferior meatus. There is one between each conchae. Now, at the back of the nasal cavity, at the very end of it, there's an opening called the internal nares, or sometimes called the connae. Now, I always called them internal nares, but now we call them connae. So now what we do is use connae as the dominant term, and internal nares is the other term. But remember, when you do things in healthcare, they will use these words, different words. If you put a tube in somebody's nose to go down into their throat, you need to understand these things are there, and how these things work. Okay, you need to understand the anatomy. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a very good diagram of this. Good model of this. I apologize. Now, we do have our external nares, our nostrils, which open up, and our nostrils at the internal nares, we have a space called the vestibule. Now, the vestibule best seen right about here, where you would enter into the nose, where your fingers usually get stuck in when you pick your nose, is usually in the vestibule. Now, what I am going to use, I'm going to go back up to about the vibrissae. Now, the vibrissae You actually are seeing a few nose hairs here, but vibrosi are the hairs. You do not have to identify vibrosi. The models don't have vibrosi. Some things, remember, I do as multiple choice questions on the examination. Other things are for identifications. Now, we'll be using the model. I have photographs of these and everything posted. The models that I use are actually all posted at the end, so we'll talk about that a little bit. Now, the hard and the soft palate. Where you will find that, here's a very good look at the hard palate, which is made up of the maxillary bone and the palatine bone, then to the soft palate that goes to the back. Now, we'll talk more about this in the section that we do later on in the digestive system. Now, the nasal septum, right here is one of the best images I have of our nasal septum, where you have the vomer at the bottom and the perpendicular plate of ethmoid bone at the top, combining together to produce what is known as our nasal septum. So this is a coronal section through a human head. You can actually see frontal sinuses here, maxillary sinuses here. You can even see that they are in fact open to the nasal cavities here. And the nasal cavities can be quite a bit occluded. There's not a huge amount of space. And this is why when you get a stuffed up nose, it is so hard. I think we think there's just a lot of space in there, but there is actually quite a lot. That's why we call these things turbinates. And you can actually see things like the superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae helping to create that kind of flow. Now, the conchae, as I said, there are the superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae. Also seen here very well is a superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae, which are going to have a superior, middle, and inferior nasal meatus between them. The meatises are found between here. Here we have a superior, middle, and inferior nasal meatus actually labeled here. And so if you're looking to find that, you'll find it there. And then the connae. Now, the best way to see the connae is going to be right here. Connae, or the internal nares, is at the very back of the nasal cavity. You will end here, and this leads to the pharynx. This is the end of nasal cavity and beginning of the pharynx. Okay? That is what that is the opening between the nasal cavity and the pharynx. This is like the border where nasal cavity and pharynx, and they have a border, and this border is easily crossed, okay? Now, as we look through these base anatomies, let's now get into the next part, and that will be the pharynx. Now, the pharynx, also, the model that I use to do those are just too big. They are about as long as the table that I'm sitting at. They take up a fair amount of space. We only have two of them right now, and they are quite expensive, and they're not going to let me bring those home. They'll let me bring some of the smaller models home. So I do apologize I couldn't do that. But we're going to see there are three distinctive things from the internal nares all the way to the larynx. We're going to see three distinctive regions: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Now, nasopharynx. The nasopharynx is going to start at those internal nares or connae and go all the way down to the soft palate. Given that, it is the most superior part of your pharynx. We start here at the nasopharynx. The pharynx goes through what we'd say NOL, N-O-L, nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx, NOL, N-O-L. That is up to down. That is superior to inferior. So inside here, we will see our soft palate. And that's actually coming from the roof of the mouth, the back of the roof of the mouth, posterior portion of it comes down. Opening up into nasopharynx is our pharyngotympanic tube. Now, the pharyngo means it opens to part of the pharynx, the nasopharynx. Tympanic, it also connects to the tympanic membrane or tympanic cavity of the middle ear. So we call it eustachian tube, named after a guy named Eustachius. So the auditory tube, pharyngotympanic tube, or eustachian tube, and it goes from the pharynx to the middle ear. specifically the tympanic cavity. Here you will find a pharyngeal tonsil. So let's take a look at the pharynx, starting here, going down here. Remember, we said that the nasopharynx goes to the soft palate. Now, what we want to do is we enter the soft palate here, okay? And you will have the opening of eustachian tube here and a pharyngeal tonsil up here. Now, we have the soft palate, and I know I just showed it. Okay. The oropharynx is in the middle. Remember, N-O-L, null, N-O-L. The O is in the middle, and it goes from the soft palate to the base of the tongue. Now, here we will find associated to it is the hyoid bone, where you have the muscles for speaking, a lot of your speaking muscles, the strap muscles that we sometimes call them, that lift. And hyoid with it is a necessity that we can tell for making complex speech. And I mean, chimpanzees have it, but theirs is very different, and it's mostly for swallowing. Now, the fauces, that goes into the mouth. So that is the opening from mouth to pharynx. So at the back of the mouth, there's the fauces. And then here the uvula hangs down as part of the soft palate, projects into the oropharynx, called the uvula, which is a word that means grape. The uvula is used a little bit in speech with vibration. We also know that it's involved in the gag reflex. I used to always, the joke I always made is I would tell my students that if you touch this structure, you can taste all the food you've eaten in the last 6 hours. And they would look at me kind of confused, as like, wouldn't that make you throw up? And I was like, that's the point. If you touch it, you'll throw up and you'll taste the food you ate. So that was the joke. Okay. Now, as we look at oropharynx, the oropharynx, we come just a little bit of that down here to the base of the tongue. So our hyoid is kind of in that plane. Here you also have a palatine tonsil, but I don't think it was not on here. The fauces is just this opening here, coming back from the mouth in is the fauces. When your doctor puts the tongue depressor and says, things like that, how much of that can be visible, like in the Mallampati score and things like that. And then the uvula. The uvula is the inferior part here that hangs down. It's called the uvula. Now, lastly, we're going to go into the laryngopharynx, the most inferior part from hyoid down to where we go to the larynx and the esophagus, where that junction is. Because of this, you can choke. So right here, we have this junction. You can go to the esophagus, or you can go down into the larynx to trachea to breathe. Now, one of the things that may happen when somebody gets trached, they sometimes, when they put the tube in, they don't hook it right. They end up putting it down the esophagus. And you will see the abdomen rising and falling. That is a very common mistake to make for people who are first learning. But those things here would be, you want to go here and see the chest rising and falling. So you'll have to learn how to do that. Those are procedures that get done. Okay. Now, okay, now larynx. Let me grab my larynx model, my little larynx instrument, and we're going to look at our larynx. And the larynx, it starts at C4 to C6. Now, a good way to remember the larynx starts at C4 is that some people have an explosive voice. Their voice box, their larynx can be quite explosive. Really powerful voice. Well, C4 is a type of explosive. C4 to C6 is where the larynx sits. C4 to C6 is where larynx sits. Now, we will see a glottis, and that's the opening which air enters and leaves the pharynx to enter the larynx. Okay. And then as we see, and you will be able to see it as we look down into the vocal cords. We will see cartilages. We'll see what's called large unpaired. There's only one of them. We'll see the epiglottis. It's what actually covers your glottis when you swallow to prevent aspiration, hopefully. The thyroid cartilage, it's the anterior wall of the larynx, is somewhat U-shaped, very large, and on it is a structure that sticks out, which is commonly referred to as the Adam's apple. On a male has usually a deeper voice because they have a larger thyroid cartilage. It acts as a greater resonating chamber, kind of like a bigger, like a bass instrument is usually larger than some of the other instruments of the same kind. Like if you have a bass, like a doghouse bass, stand-up bass. The cricoid cartilage, that's the bottom or inferior wall of larynx. Now, the next three, two of which we can see, the third one we can't, are the small paired. There will be two of these. The first one is called arytenoid, one is called corniculate. They do the same job. The muscles attached to them to open and close the glottis and involved in sounds. When glottis opens and closes, this is involved in hiccups, but it's also, if you control this in the right way and tighten up your vocal cords and breathe, controlling breathing in the right way, placing the tongue in the right place, like either the tip of the teeth, the upper part of your palate, la 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 la. So like when you make L sounds, la, you got to take the tongue up at the top of the palate, la, ta 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 ta. Fa 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 fa. When you make sounds, you either have to like use teeth, like to almost bite the lips in a fa sound, or so lips, tongue, the roof of the mouth, all kind of have to coordinate along with breathing to be able to speak. And we do learn that from the people around. This is why we have accents. Sometimes people say we have an odd accent. I've had students, they said, well, you don't have an accent, and they don't think I'm from here, or at least from the South. It's like anyone who is not from Southern United States, if I go up anywhere else when I travel out of the South, they're like, man, you sound like you from the mountains, Tennessee, which I was born in the mountains of Tennessee, Possum Trot Ridge. But I feel like I don't sound like a mountain person now, but people will take that. Now, our arytenoid cartilages and our corniculate cartilages, we'll see them. We'll see the vocal folds are called our vocal cords. They're very elastic, a lot of elastic fibers, and they vibrate. And then along the side of them, there's what's called the ventricular folds or vestibular folds, which are guarding things going down into the glottis. So when something hits these, you get a cough reflex. So a lot of times your post-sinus strip that drains back into the connae, into the pharynx, the mucus will get on there, and then you'll have to cough and try to expel those things out. All right, let's take a look at that. And this is how I do mine. So what we're going to do, and I hope, let me flip the camera. Come on, there we go, little camera. All right, and let me see how much, I can't even see it. I can't see the shiny buttons. The buttons are so shiny, they're reflecting the light coming in my window right now. So I just can't really see them. Okay. And let me lock this down so it can't change its focus. Okay, so what we're going to start off with, real quick, I want to point out one structure that is on here, and that is the hyoid, a very important structure for speaking. What I like to do is going here and saying, first we have our larynx. The larynx, C4 to C6, and we are looking at the larynx here. The larynx is our voice box, C4 to C6 vertebral level. Now, what we are then going to notice is, we go to look at that, we are now going to see our epiglottis. On this model, the the epiglottis is right here, as you will begin to see. It is on a spring, the epiglottis, and it should fold down to cover the glottis, the area we're looking down into. If you open this up, the glottis is down in there, and these will be your vocal cords we're going to look at in a minute. Now, next, we are discussing the thyroid cartilages. And the thyroid cartilage is this very large cartilage. And on it, you will see on the anterior wall, the anterior aspect of it right here is our thyroid, our laryngeal prominence, the Adam's apple. And the cricoid cartilage is the inferior wall. You will see it making this aspect here, all this here, this portion here, and now we have some tissues covering it up so we can't see it there. So we could see the cricoid cartilage. Now, the arytenoid and corniculate can be seen. Now, the arytenoid is going to be a little bit larger. To see it, we want to turn this guy around at the back, and you're going to see the two arytenoids, the large one here and the large one here. Now, the corniculate, cornu means horn, and these are the little horn-shaped cartilages here. You can see where it ends here. You can see them here, the horn-shaped cartilages on the end. They would have muscles and stuff attached to these that can open these up, and they can help open and control the opening of the glottis and help me taut or loosen these vocal cords up so they vibrate when we speak. Oh, clicked on the wrong thing there. Now let's talk about the vocal folds and vestibular folds. Now, the vocal folds are these guys here, right here in the middle. And you'll see they kind of have string in them. Right here, they're called the true vocal folds, or the vocal cords. And then on either side here and here are the vestibular folds. And this helps open the control the opening into what would be glottis that would lead down into the airway and things like that. All right. So as we look at those, I hope that helps to see it. Here we have Chad to help us see this. This guy's name, I nicknamed him Chad. He looks like a Chad to me. And you can see some nice diagrams showing these as well from the notes and looking down, laryngoscope, actually seeing it. This person here, the reason they were having their laryngoscope done is this little thing right here. This is what is called a vocal nodule, something that I think that I get sometimes during the semester when I talk too much. Here you can actually see the cuneiform cartilage here, just we can't normally see it on the models. They're not there. And you can see the glottis going into here. So everything that I was showing you was correct. Now let's look at our trachea. Now the trachea is our windpipe. And the windpipe starts at C6 where the larynx stops and goes down to T5 vertebral levels, C6 to T5 vertebral levels. Okay, starting at C6 down to T5. Now, it's hard to keep those up. It takes repetition. Memory devices, things like that sometimes. I didn't have a really good one here. We know that C6 is where it picks up. C6 to T5, trachea. Trachea, we got to think, at least we know thoracic, and you will have to know this. These will be things I ask sometimes. Something's vertebral level. When you see a vertebral level on my anatomy notes, you know you're probably going to be asked one of them. I'm not telling you which ones, but I say you know you probably are going to get asked one. Now, on this, there will be about 15 to 20 tracheal cartilages. There's 15 or 20 of them in between there, and they look like the letter C. The part of the letter C is in the front and then flat at the opened up at the back, and it stiffens the walls of the trachea. It's much like the vacuum cleaner you use at the house. If you guys have a vacuum cleaner, there are rings in the vacuum cleaner hose, so when you turn on the vacuum cleaner hose, it doesn't collapse on itself. And that's the same thing here. This stiffens the wall of the trachea so it doesn't collapse on itself. And as we go to look at it, we're going to see the trachea and the tracheal cartilages, and we'll get started on that. So here we have our larynx at the top, and let me kind of do a little bit of that where this lighting gets a little bit better. And I actually can tilt that a little bit different. Our larynx coming down, we have our trachea. And on our trachea, there should be about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Oh, there should be 15 to 20 of them. Let's see how many there are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then the last one here. Yeah, they did not get that very right, did they? There are about 15 to 20 of them that should be on here on the trachea. Now, the trachea has those tracheal cartilages that I showed you. Now, then we're going to look at our bronchial tree, and this is what branches off the trachea. The branches off the trachea are called the bronchial tree. There will be 3 major bronchi that come off, and then off the last bronchi, there will be bronchioles down to the alveolar sacs and the alveoli. Now, what's going to happen is, guys, our bronchial tree with the bronchi, bronchioles down to the alveoli, we have our main bronchus called a primary bronchus. Now, I always call it a primary bronchus. I always did it primary, secondary, tertiary first, and then I'd use the other names, and we've kind of moved to calling it main, lobar, and segmental. But I'm going to probably kind of do, but I will use those names, and alternate names are things you need to know. So the main or primary bronchus, there's a right one and a left one, and you will notice that the right one actually has less of an angle that it travels, and it's more likely objects are to get in there. When I was a student, my anatomy professor had a penchant for, so by 2 weeks in the class, he knew everybody's name, but when he'd get in class and he'd be like, we'd be talking about something, he'd ask a question, and he would snap his finger and point to you and call you Dr. So-and-so. And after he did that one time, we all realized you better always do the readings and better be ready or you're going to feel stupid. So I was in there. We were on the one specific time we're on the area of the torso anatomy. And he asks, he goes, little Timmy has swallowed a penny. What are you going to do, Dr. Letford? Snaps his finger and points at me, and I said I'd check the right primary bronchus because of the angle that's where it's most likely to be. And he looks at me and says, well, you're not going to image him? What if he has an anatomical anomaly? And I was like, yeah, so you were never right with him. Okay, so I learned so much from that professor, though. So the right and left, as it branches, there will be an internal ridge where it branches called the carina. And then we'll see the lobar or secondary bronchi, which come off the main bronchus. They are called lobar because there's one for each lobe of the lung. So there will be 2 on the left side, 3 on the left side, 2 on the right side. Sorry about that. I got it backwards there for a second. And so there are differences because there's actually one for each lobe of the lung. And then the segmental, because they actually go to what's called bronchopulmonary segments. So we also call them tertiary bronchi. They're branches off your lobar. And then off of our tertiary bronchi, there's what's called bronchioles. And the bronchioles are much smaller. They lack cartilages, so they are very sensitive to spasms and things like that. And oftentimes with bronchioles, you can have some obstruction going on there. Then you go into the alveolar sacs, and the alveoli are the small little sacs where gas exchange happens. Kind of imagine your lungs is like a trash bag full of balloons, and each little balloon is an alveoli. And you could take a bunch of alveoli and cluster them together into a functional unit called an alveolar sac. And alveolar sacs coming off of bronchioles. And as we talk about that, that'll become very functionally important in as you guys try to learn diseases like emphysema, COPD, things like that, and asthma specifically. Some of those there be some big ones you'll talk about. Okay, so off of our trachea, we have our 2 primary bronchi, also called the main bronchus. Off the main bronchus, we can have what is called secondary bronchi or lobar bronchi here and here, or here and here. Let's see, where's the other one here? I think some of the stuff is broken, so it's okay. And here, so here, here, and here. Some of the things break, and I can't see it too well. Okay, and here, and here. Then we get the tertiary, and that's all the pretty colors. These are actually color-coded to the bronchiopulmonary segments they go to, so these are your tertiary bronchi. And then we go to bronchioles. Now, what I want to show you is as we go to bronchioles, it's a little bit different, okay? And here you can see it, our trachea, we have our primary or main bronchus, then we have our secondary bronchi, we have our tertiary bronchi or segmental bronchi. Down as we go to bronchioles, the bronchioles go down, and then we end up into alveolar sacs, like for example here, an alveolar sac. That we would have one major sac of alveoli. Here's an alveolar sac, here's an alveolar sac, and then each alveolar sac is composed of multiple alveoli. Each alveoli or alveolus, these things are very highly vascularized, and they help exchange the air that we breathe to get the blood of the lungs oxygenated, removing CO2 from the blood. This is what we talked a little bit about in heart and blood flow, is how that actually functions. A little bit is that it went in and the lung capillaries did this. Now you're actually seeing lung capillaries. All right, and we can see an alveolar sac here quite well. One nice alveolar sac. I just had that separated as a nice image. Now, as we go in, the last thing we want to talk about is pleura. Now, pleura, what I want to talk about with pleura, and I am going to draw, is that pleura is the membrane that surrounds the lungs, the serous membrane surrounding lungs. Now, it plays an incredibly important role in ventilation. This is what happens if you perforate it, you get a pneumothorax or a collapsed lung. So I'm going to get out two of my favorite colors to use with this, but let's talk about the pleura real quick. And what I want to talk about when it comes to pleura is, okay, there we go. When it comes to pleura, let's say I'm coming down here with a trachea, and then it branches primary and main bronchi. And then we have our lung. Left lung, right lung. At least here I can erase my mistakes a little bit, even though I'm using ink. Gosh. There we go. Now what we're going to do, and I'll use green here. It doesn't really matter which color I use, but what I'm going to do is we always have one layer that is right there on the tissue, right there on the organ, and then we always have another layer that is outside of that. Now, there should not be very much space between these, but we have a parietal layer called the parietal pleura, and we have a visceral layer called the visceral pleura. And the lungs sit in the pleural cavities, okay? And just in case we couldn't tell, this is supposed to be my lung, okay? And this is the pleura, okay? Now, what I want to do is talk about the pleura. The pleura surrounds the lungs. There is a parietal pleura that actually is the inner surface of thoracic wall. So it's actually fused to the inside of the ribs. If I zoom in here, we would actually be able to see where do they actually label it. I'm trying to remember where parietal pleura gets labeled on this diagram. I know somewhere it is labeled, and I just don't remember where parietal pleura actually got labeled. I know where it would be. I just don't remember where they actually give the name. Oh, here it is, Pleura. And I wanted to show it because I wanted to follow that. And you can see that it's fused to the inside of the chest cavity. And then on the covering the surface of the lung is the visceral pleura. Okay. Now, the pleural cavities is where the lung sits. The lung is actually sitting in the pleural cavities, which is a subdivision of the thoracic cavity. Remember, thoracic cavity has the pleural cavities, it has the mediastinum, and the pericardial cavity, are three subdivisions that we begin to see here. All right. And let's look at the lungs itself. And I have a model for the lungs. We'll use these models in a minute. And we'll talk about it. And we're going to talk about a structure that we've already heard of. We saw this structure once already with a lymph node and with the spleen. And it's called a hilum. And a hilum is where the pulmonary vessels, pulmonary arteries and veins and nerves and the bronchi, the primary bronchi, enter into the lung. Then we're going to see three surfaces. We're going to see a diaphragmatic, a costal, a mediastinal surface, a cardiac notch, a base, and an apex. Okay. Now, as I go in, one of the things I want to make sure you guys can see when it comes to the base is just the bottom lip here. And we'll talk about that, the base and apex. But because the model I have, you can't really move it as well. But I am going to use it. So let me grab it. And you guys can see that I'm wearing shorts today. I'm at home and trying to be a little comfortable today. You know, it's a hot, muggy day here in Tennessee. All right, let's do it this way. Still, even them may not be able to get it all in there, but we will do our best. Okay. And I can at least do this too if need be. Okay. Now, what I want to do is talk about, I'm going to move this just a wee smidge. Okay. So let's, again, the hilum. So how are we going to find the hilum? This is where everything attaches. So we're inside. So we're going to take all this stuff right here off, move it out of the way off camera. And then we have our heart. Now, where all that happens to go into, now so we could see it, I've got to assemble it again. I just had to take the stuff out. And you can see, number one, let me grab my point and stick. You can actually see the hilum here. The hilum is the area where all the blood vessels, bronchi, and things like that attach and go in. It's called the hilum. Now, the hilum, next we're going to see our diaphragmatic surface, our costal surface, and our mediastinal surface. Now, diaphragmatic surface, it means it needs a conformed diaphragm. Diaphragm is down here at the bottom, where the diaphragm would be right here. Diaphragm would be sitting right here. So this is called the diaphragmatic surface. The diaphragmatic surface here is going to conform to the shape of the diaphragm. Now, the front surface of the lungs, called the costal surface, is conforming to the ribs, hence costal. And the mediastinal surface, if you want to see it, is, let's put the heart in. Let's imagine we see now, I just want to make sure we can see where the heart is right here. And I'm going to take the heart out, sneak it out the bottom here. And that is the mediastinal surface, is the area inside where the heart would touch. Okay? Now, the cardiac notch, this is found only on the left lung. Why is that? Why is it found only in left lung? That's the position of the heart. 2/3 of the heart's mass lies to the left of midline. As it appears here, oh, that's why it won't go in there too well. I was like, why is that not fitting? I don't think I have the right heart, actually, the one that actually goes to this model. It's possible somebody put the wrong one in it when they used it last. Okay, so I was having trouble getting it back together again because that thing doesn't want to fit. Okay, Now let me go back and see what I was talking about. Okay, we were talking about the cardiac notch. 2/3 of the heart's mass lies to the left of midline. Right here, you see a notch that allows for the heart to go in. So this is on the left lung only. Cardiac notch. The base and the apex. Now the base is basically down here at the bottom. It would be where the back sits on the plate. And the apex is the upper part. Apex, to listen to all the lungs, you got to go up to the clavicle, where clavicle, first rib, and everything are, to listen downwards. All right, let's talk about the lungs, and let's get into their lobes. Now, the right lung and the left lung are very different in terms of number of lobes. Right lung has 3 lobes, superior, middle, and inferior lobe. With 3 lobes, there are 2 fissures, an oblique and horizontal fissure. Now, the oblique fissure is what separates inferior lobe from the middle and superior. Whereas horizontal fissure, that separates superior from middle lobe. So let's take a look at these in our model. What I'm going to do is flip this around. So now when you look at the model, it's going to be flipped the other way that you saw it. So I can show you the right lung. And the right lung, we have a superior lobe, a middle lobe, and then an inferior lobe. And right here, you can actually see where the inferior lobe starts. Inferior, middle, superior lobe. Superior lobe, there is a horizontal fissure here below it. And here we can actually pretty well see our oblique fissure. And if I tilt it just a little bit, you'll be able to see the oblique fissure very nicely. Okay. All right. Now, as we turn our attention to the left lung, you're going to see that there's a cardiac notch and only 2 lobes, and that is the superior and inferior lobe. So it only has 1 fissure, the oblique fissure. And I've moved this a little bit just so when we look at it, so we can see the left lung very well. We can very well distinguish the left lung superior lobe and inferior lobe with the oblique fissure that separates it. And of course, again, the cardiac notch, which is there because of the position of the heart. Left lung is smaller because of that. Now, here we can see all the lung structures as well, if you also have that for reference. My study guides are basically like, okay, you need to know everything, but then I break down everything we went through, know what's going on. Practice images are down here. This will be the only diagram that I use. And here are the structures to actually ask it. You can actually see the visceral and parietal pleura here. This is the nasal cavity diagram I will be using. And this is the pharynx. Now, everything else, this one here, I just can't bring it with me, but those will be used. You can also find these on my D2L page under respiratory models labeled, where there is respiratory system models labeled, and the answers are there. I do need to add some more of my Jeopardy games. I don't think I have them all done. I was going through and editing some things, and I try to give those for extra study. I just don't have one up there right now because they had to go through some clearing because we made some changes since I wrote them. So this concludes my lab, guys. I hope you found it helpful. And for anybody who is watching this, who's actually not one of my students, but just basically you have become my student by watching my YouTube channel, thank you again for watching. I hope you find it helpful. Please share with people because I think my videos that are going to have the models in it are really going to be helpful for students in a lot of programs and a lot of areas who have to learn those models on their own. But guys, thank you. Have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.